And I do a whole lot more of selling cards to people, other people that collect postcards. But something I got into 5 or 6 years ago as an offshoot of my antiques business, and once I got into it, I found out that it surprised me at the start of how many people collect postcards and what they collect. I mean, any topic that you can probably think of in life, there's somebody that collects postcards of that, whether it's picture postcards that's got the devil on it, cupids, ones that got teddy bears, you name it, whatever you like, you can probably find a postcard that relates to that thing that you collect. And people are like that. They collect all sorts of different subjects and topic matter on postcards. So what I'm going to kind of tell you about today is the history of postcards, when they started here in the United States, clear up until the present time, kind of how they progressed. Then I'll talk about different kinds of postcards out there. There's basically 4 different types of postcards. And then I'll talk a little bit about actually collecting postcards, things that are good to collect and things that maybe aren't quite so good to collect if you're trying to build a collection that may be worth money in the future sometimes, because there are certain topics there that they're not worth much today, and 20 years from now they'll still not be worth very much, just because they are either so common or there's so little interest in those particular topics. So I'll give you some ideas that if you want to collect some topics that have been proven through time that are of interest to people and that will continue to be of interest to people in the future, so that brought into the United States up to the present time. Now, and when I talk about when they were introduced, I'm talking about picture postcards. I'm not talking about all the little postcards that were pre-printed by the U.S. government with a stamp already on it. It's kind of the ones you can still see today sometimes. Just a plain old manila type postcard that was published by the government that had a 1-cent stamp on it. Those were around back in the 1840s, 1850s and onwards, and they were sold, and all that be on them the businesses would use something to write on the back saying, "We received your $2 payment on your loan, thank you," and they would mail it out, and that's the kind of cards. What I'm talking about is picture postcards, cards that actually had a picture, and those were introduced into the United States in 1893 as part of the Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. That was the first time that they introduced picture postcards here in the United States. And people went kind of crazy over them. And I've got 3 examples here that these are all from the Columbian Exposition of 1893. And they were still put out by the U.S. government. They all came with a pre-printed 1-cent stamp on them. They did allow a few private companies to print the cards and then have a stamp box where you place a stamp. For those cards, these were 1 cent. The private companies that printed cards and you had to put a stamp on, you had to put a 2-cent stamp on it. So, and this introduced what we call the pioneer era of postcards, and this was from 1893 up until 1898. Predominantly, they would publish postcards for various expositions and things like that during that time period. Most of them that I find are from the Chicago World's Fair, but I've had a couple others from other expositions that I've come across and sold from expositions, like I said, for these expositions. And with these cards, the only thing that could be on the back of the card was the address of the person you were going to send it to. If you wanted to write a message, you had to write it on the face of the card. The back was always reserved just for the address. Most of these pioneer cards that I've ever come across, and you don't come across, they're not, I won't call them rare or that, but they are fairly scarce. You don't come across them that often. I find very few of them that were ever actually postally used and addressed to somebody. It was like most people, especially the World's Fair ones, which were some of the first ones, people bought them as souvenirs kept them but didn't ever actually mail them to anybody or send them to anybody. So they usually find them in pretty good condition because they weren't postally used. People bought them, hung on to them as a souvenir of that World's Fair. In 1898, the government decided to grant permission to private enterprises to print and sell postcards then. And these cards were called private mailing cards. I've got a few examples of those here. These are some examples from my collection. These are all kind of patriotic, historical in nature. On the back they say private mailing cards, or some of them you find will say souvenir card. None of them ever say postcard yet. They all just say private mailing card or souvenir card, and every one of them will have this statement across the back here, authorized by Act of Congress of May 19th, 1898. That was required to be on all these private mailing cards that were produced from 1898 to 1901. And again, these cards, you don't find a lot of these types of postcards either. They're a little bit harder to find, but they are out there where you can find, you know, like I said, I won't call them rare, but I'll call them scarce. They're not the kind of cards that you'll run across every day in somebody's postcard collection, but they are available and out there. So it's for a very short time, and like I said, this was the first time the government actually kind of let loose control of the cards and let private companies print these and sell these. And of course they all had to have a stamp on them then, and they reduced it then to a 1-cent stamp to mail these. And like the other cards, you could only put the address on the back, any messages, and this one's been postally used. You can see that somebody wrote a little sentence down here on the bottom, but any comments or letters that you wanted to make to somebody had to be written on the face of the card. From that period of time, then we went to what they called the undivided back period of cards, and this was from 1901 until 1907. And this was the first time that people or the publishers could legally put on the back of the cards postcard rather than private mailing card. They can now call these postcards. But they were still address only on the back. And these are some examples, again, for my personal collection of alphabet cards. But these cards give you a better example how people would write all over the card to get their message to the people they were sending the card to, because they couldn't write on the back, and so any place they could find a spare bit of room on the front of the card, they would write their note. And you see cards where they just kind of written all around the border and into the center, and you just kind of got to follow it around to see what they were trying to tell the person that they were writing to. And these cards were around, and here's some more. These were alphabet cards, artist drawing cards. These are some view cards of, let's see, I think these are all New York, if I recall, yeah. These are places in New York. These are from, again, the undivided back period. But what they would do a lot of times when they showed a view card, they would leave a white border on the card someplace to allow people to write their notes without writing over the top of the picture that you were trying to show on the card. And these are, like I said, were all various places in New York City on these particular cards. Finally, in 1907, they changed the back of the cards and went to what we call the divided back postcard. And that was when they first split the back of the card, allowed you to write a note on the left-hand side, the address on the right-hand side, and the stamp box up in the upper right-hand corner. And that then has been that format is continued on to the present-day postcards. It's always been that way since 1907. Right on the left, address on the right, stamp in the box. And it was still penny postcards, 1 cent. And I'll just add into the side, they kept postcards at a penny for an extremely long period of time. It wasn't a thing, couldn't remember the exact date, and my internet's down right now, but I think it was after World War II before they ever raised the price of postcards from 1 cent up to 2 cents. Now, obviously, since then, they've made jumps a lot more rapidly than that. But for 30-some years, it was kept at a penny to mail a postcard. And this first divided back period from 1907 to 1915 was probably the peak of postcard publishing. And it's what we call the golden era of postcards. Some of the greatest artists of postcards, some of the best publishers of postcards printed and made their postcards during the period from 1907 to 1915. And this was the period of time when everybody collected postcards. I mean, postcards were just the thing. It's kind of like the Beanie Baby craze from a few years ago. Everybody collected postcards. They sent postcards to people just so they could get them and collect them. And that's why you find so many old albums at auctions and that and other places just filled with postcards, postcard albums. Everybody wanted postcards and collected them, and people, like I say, would buy them just to mail them to people, just so they would get a postcard with a picture on it. Photographs. They sold cameras. And my Aunt Helen gave me a camera that it's a postcard camera. Polaroid developed a camera there in the early 1900s that would take pictures. It was a camera where the film in it was, when you pulled it out of the camera, was basically postcard size, the negative. Was postcard sized, and you could take a picture, take it to your drugstore or a photograph shop that would develop them, and they develop them on postcard paper for you so that you could then mail your photographs to your family and stuff. So you take a picture of your house or your relatives or whatever, take it, get several copies developed at a drugstore, that, and then mail it, put a stamp on it, mail it to your friends and relatives. And these cameras came with a little metal pin with the camera so that when you took the film out, you could even write a caption on the negative, so that when it was developed, that caption would be on the negative if you wanted it there. The only thing you had to remember was that this was a negative and that you had to write backwards. Because when you developed the picture, then it would come out and be readable right side. But if you didn't do that, if you wrote it just like you would normally write on the negative, when they printed it, it would be backwards on the actual photo. And occasionally, when I go through cards and that, look at cards, occasionally every once in a while you'll find one where they developed it backwards, where the person that wrote on the card forgot to write backwards, and so it ends up backwards on the negative. So that period, up to 1915, was the best period. The best postcards were published during that time period. Why did it quit in 1915? World War I. Because the best printers were in Germany. Germany printed basically all the postcards that were used here in the United States. The artists and other things that drew a lot of the cards, they worked here in the United States. They would draw their cards and that, but when the publishers went to publish them or to make copies, they were sent to Germany and they printed them over there because they had the best quality printers over there. They used the best inks, the brightest and most vibrant colors on the cards, all came from Germany. World War I started, that stopped. And so now we enter a new period where it was American publishers that had to print the cards. And they were not nearly as good. And that starts from 1915 to 1930, a period of time that we call the white border postcards. And we call it that because when they printed the cards, they would leave a white border all around the edge of the card. And the reason they did that was because then they used less ink to make the picture. And it was a way to save costs on the postcards. And so, while these cards are not poor quality. They're certainly not the quality of the cards that were coming out of Germany prior to World War I. The American companies were just not that good. They didn't use quite as good of inks with their coloring and stuff. And like I said, they would always put a white border around it just to save a little bit of money and not have to use as much ink. If you look at the cards, oh, here's just some examples of cards from the period of 1915, some holiday cards. You'll notice that the coloring and everything on the card goes all the way out to the border. I mean, they just used better quality and they weren't concerned that much about the cost. American publishers then were worried about cost and stuff, and so we got these white border cards. Around 1930, which another date that stands out because that was pretty much the start of the Depression, we went to a different type of card, and kind of a new era of postcards. It's what we call the linen era of postcards. And this was from 1930 to 1945. And they're called linen postcards from that time period because they used a paper that had a really high rag content. And so the paper was very thick and rough, and it had the feel and look of linen cloth. And so it's what we call the linen era. Again, because it was during the Depression, companies were trying to cut costs, so they went to lower quality paper, this high rag content paper. They used inks in that, again, that were not that great, and so these linen cards all have a look and feel to them that you won't find in other postcards. If you look at them, I've got some here. These are all linen cards here. A lot of advertising cards, a lot of comic cards, but if you take them out and afterwards, if you want to take them out and feel these, you can, but you can feel that they've got that texture of that's different than a smooth paper of some of these earlier postcards. So, like I said, more like linen cloth, and that's why it was called linen. So, those were used all the way, produced probably a little, they say 1945, but it's not like there was an exact date where they cut off and quit doing that. It was just an approximate time when they kind of quit publishing cards on that type of paper. And the last cards that were made, and they continue right up to today, is what we call photochrome postcards. A lot of times postcard dealers and collectors just refer to them as chromes. You hear somebody say it's a chrome, what they're talking about is a more modern day card. And photochromes first came out in 1939 and they continue up to today, but they're your regular old high glossy type postcards. Smooth paper, very glossy front face on them. It's what we call photochromes. They became popular in '39, and by the end of World War II, they became the most popular type of postcard, and so that's what all the publishers were then started to use. So that's the 7 eras or that of postcards, all the way up to the present time, different types of postcards. Now within postcards themselves, there's 4 different types of postcards. There's artist-drawn postcards, there are PhotoView postcards, there are real photo postcards, and then a 4th category that's kind of a catch-all that we call novelty postcards. The first, I'll talk about artist-drawn postcards. These are any card that, again, were drawn by some artist. They sat someplace at a board or that and drew the pictures. And most of these artist-drawn postcards, the zenith for them was during the golden age of postcards from 1907 to 1915. There are artists that were just incredible artists that did all their work on postcards during that time frame. Because this was still, there were magazines out there, and there were a lot of these people that did artist work for the postcard publishing company also did work for comic strips and newspapers, would do artwork for magazines sometimes. Some artists you can think of from that time period, Harrison Fisher You may be familiar with him. He did a lot of work with what they known as the Gibson Girl type artwork. His artwork is on a lot of postcards, but you also find a lot of the early magazines that had his Gibson Girl photos or drawings in the magazines. But there were hundreds of artists that worked during this time period that made their living doing artwork for postcard companies. And there's some fabulous artists out there, and there's a lot of postcards are collected by people just for a specific artist. Some of the more popular ones that are still reasonably prized, Ellen Clapsaddle was a female artist here in the United States. I have a lot of people that collect her artwork. Frances Brundage, who did a lot of work both here and in England for Tux. That did work on postcards. Brundage did a lot of child. She was famous for her child artwork. She did a lot of work in children's books, doing the artwork for various children's books in the early 1900s. But there's hundreds of artists, and like I said, there are a lot of people that will find an artist whose work they like, and they just collect postcards of that particular artist's work. Now the next type of postcard are what we call PhotoView postcards. Now these aren't actual photographs. These are cards where they take a photograph and color it in and use it to make a postcard. These are some examples of PhotoView postcards. You can tell that there are real depicts a real building, and it was taken from a photograph, but instead they just colored it in, because most of the photography, these are early 1900s postcards. They still were a ways away from color photography at the time. So they would just take a photograph and then color it in and print thousands of copies of the card for the merchants to sell of different views and stuff. So these are different from, they had obviously somebody that worked on these to color them in, but it was different from artist postcards because this wasn't artwork. It was just, anybody could sit down and do the coloring